Hello and welcome to the first Financial Wellness Resolution webinar series of the year. Thank you all for your participation and really hope you and your families are doing well under these very uncertain times. My name is Cris Lopez and I'm the head of fund management for EMEA at MetLife. We wanted to kick off the year sharing with you some insights about financial planning and portfolio construction to help you and your clients achieving your financial goals. So for that, we have the pleasure of having with us Leo Niers, head of Franklin Templeton's Academy. Hi, Leo. Good morning to you in London.
Good morning.
We got Simon Putt, senior financial advisor at Skybound Wealth. Hi, Simon. Good afternoon.
Good day to you, Chris.
Just very quickly before we start, we'll have a Q&A session of 10 to 15 minutes at the end. So please, if you want to ask questions, you have to put your questions on the question tab on the go to webinar. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So Leo, I think we can start with you. In the last year, markets did experience a high degree of volatility. And we'll look at the U.S. market. The S&P 500 lost more than 30% in one single month, only to recover around 65% from the lows to the end of the year. With all the uncertainty that we're currently facing, it is very likely that volatility will continue this year as well. So how do you think investors can better live with market volatility?
Thank you, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be a panelist on this webinar today. And to answer your question, I would actually like to discuss 3 tips how to better deal with volatility. And if we move to the next slide, the first tip is on the next slide. So I would really say to stay calm and focus on the long term. I think this is a very important tip, which is very well illustrated on the next slide. So if we move to the next slide, then we see that volatility has always been there, which is caused to various events, as you see in this chart. However, it's important that you stay patient, and patience will be rewarded in the long term. As you see, for example, in this chart, if you would have invested $10,000 at the end of 1987 in the MSCI All Country World Index, that would have resulted in roughly $111,000 at the end of June last year, which is equal to an annualized return of roughly 7.7%. So staying focused on the long term is very important, because it might be tempting to time the market when there is volatility, and that's what we have illustrated on the next slide. So if we move to the next slide, we show the dangers of trying to time the market. What we've done here is, over a period of 10 years, we've listed both the 10 worst as well as the 10 best trading days. Now, what you see that in times of volatility, those worst trading days are often immediately followed by the best trading days, and the other way around. So that shows how difficult it is to time the market and to just be invested just before best day, and to be withdrawn from the market just before the worst day. Even the most professional investors don't have a crystal ball. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. And therefore, as you can see in this chart, it's extremely difficult to time the market. And it can also be very costly, as we have illustrated on the next slide. So on the next slide, basically, we look at the annualized return again of the MSCI All Country World over a 10-year period. And what we see here is what that annualized return would be if you would have just missed the 10 best trading days out of that 10-year period. You see your return would roughly be 4.4%. Would you have instead missed the 20 best trading days, then that return would only be 1.7%. Whereas if you would have missed the 30 best trading days over that 10-year period, your return would only be minus 0.7%. Whereas if you wouldn't have missed any of those best trading days, and if you would have stayed fully invested, then your return would be 8.8%. So again, that confirms how important those best trading days are for the overall return. And as we saw on the previous slide, is how difficult it is to time them. So that would be my first tip, to really stay focused and stay invested and not try to time the market. Then let's move to the next slide. Another important tip is that diversification matters, right? And diversification may reduce your overall volatility and provide a smoother ride through bumpy markets. And I don't think any other chart better illustrates that than on the next slide. So what we see on the next slide, basically since 2005, we have ranked asset classes year after year. So we put the best performing asset classes on the top and the worst performing asset classes on the bottom. So for example, we see that from 2005 to 2007, emerging market equities were the best performing asset class, but they were the worst performing asset class in 2008, and again the best performing asset class in 2009 again. So you see there's no pattern that repeats itself. Every year there's a different ranking in terms of the best and the worst asset classes, and nobody knows what that ranking will look like at the end of this year. So that's why it's important. Your best bet is to spread your capital over various asset classes, various regions, various countries, various sectors, and various individual issuers to smooth out that market volatility. And finally, our third tip would be to really stay focused on your goals. Some investors just invest for the sake of investing or to make a return. And those investors are more likely to withdraw from the market in times of market volatility. We would encourage investors to really stay focused on their long-term goals, because if you see your investments in line with your goals, you're much more likely to stay invested and to stay invested during times of market volatility if you see your investments in line with your goals. So 3 tips for better dealing with market volatility: stay invested for the long term and don't try to time the market. Have a proper diversification, and third of all, stay focused on your goals. That's it towards your first question, Cris.
Thank you. I think you touched on some very important points. I really like your diversification slide. This is one that I've used myself in the past. And I think it really shows how difficult it is to predict the future winners, and you know, it's all about staying diversified over the long term. So Simon, on that note, if we look at markets today, equities, they look to me very stretched, or at least certain markets and sectors seem to be trading at quite high multiples. We look at the fixed income, we have 18 trillion of debt trading at negative yields, and real yields on US high quality corporate debt, investment grade, also turned negative for the first time in history. So on that note, what would be your best advice for investors? How do you think, what do you think they should do?
Yeah, thank you, Cris. And I'd like to also reiterate, thanks for allowing me to participate in this webinar. In terms of addressing the question, I'm actually going to take this really back to fundamentals, which is almost irrespective of the current market conditions, because I think there are certain fundamentals that we all need to embrace, and then we can think a little bit more specifically about the current situation. The first things I would like to make sure of is really making sure that investors have strong foundations for their investors. So there's a couple of things I would like to look for first with potential investors. The first is that they've got a good cash position, so that if there's some kind of emergency situation, or, you know, as we've seen in the last few months, if someone suddenly loses their job, they've got the wherewithal to keep going without having to raid their investments. We want to keep their investments nice and integral and allowed to continue to perform and grow. So let's just make sure people have got the right liquidity position so that they can cope, they can live and deal with emergency situations. What am I talking about? You know, as a general rule of thumb, we say to people, have 3 to 6 months of your monthly expenditure as a cash position or access to liquidity. To have less than that might expose you to liquidity shortfall risk. To have more than that begins to become inefficient. And it's at that point that we would start having an investment discussion with someone. The second prerequisite that I'd like to make sure of is that people are protecting their wealth, protecting their investment. You know, unfortunately, bad things happen, catastrophic things can happen. We've seen it none more obviously than in the last 12 months. And, you know, none of us is immune to serious illness, things that can stop us working. In that kind of situation, you don't want to be raiding your investments in order to cope with the emergency situation. So this is why we actively talk to people about having the right insurance in place to protect them against critical illness, to protect against a death situation. As I say, all of this is about making sure that you can keep your investments integral, preserved, and allowed to continue to perform. Having addressed those prerequisites, then a very simple piece of advice, which is start, don't procrastinate, get on with it. I'll talk about that in a moment, but just want to consider a couple of things. If you are going to start investing, and to an extent this is reiterating some of the points that Leo has eloquently made, but the first point we need to be aware of is know your time horizon. Investing by its definition is a medium to long-term exercise. For example, planning for your retirement, which might be in 20 or 30 years time, or planning for your children's university cost needs, which might be 18 years away. These are long-term considerations, and investing is absolutely the solid way to go forward on these. If your time horizon is something like 1 to 2 years, and you know you want that cash in 1 to 2 years time, well, maybe it's worth taking a step back and taking a more prudent approach. Investing can work, but you are exposing yourself to market risk. And if there is the kind of market movement that we saw, for example, last March, who knows if there's going to be the time for the cycle to recover again for you to get your money back in time for your needs. So in that kind of situation, I know that the returns are lousy, but it's probably worth putting it on deposit in a bank. But if your horizons are longer than that, then certainly consider investing. The second point is know your risk. Know your tolerance for risk. Some people are very aggressive in their investment stance. Some people are naturally very conservative. This is where you need to sit down with a specialist, with a financial advisor who can help you with the right kind of questionnaire, with the metrics, which will see where you sit on the spectrum. And then it's important. You need to make sure you're invested in the right way to suit your risk and to suit your objectives, as well as time horizon. But then having said start, I mean, really the reason for that has been to a large extent answered by Leo, is this mantra that the best way to accumulate wealth is time in the markets, not timing the markets. It's proven over the years, the charts that we saw, that over the long term, markets will grow. We may have volatility and downward corrections along the way, but those are short-term considerations against long-term market growth. You know, it is possible, I'm not going to rule it out, to time the market, to jump in at a very propitious moment and really reap the benefits of that. But in my view, a lot of the benefits that come from that come from luck as much as judgment. And, you know, I'm sure we've all seen it, where someone thinks they're being clever, they're waiting for the right timing to come, but markets don't always do what we think they should do. They have their own irrationality, and if you're sitting there for the right moment, there's a real risk that opportunity will sail away and that ship is not coming back, and it's going to become a more expensive exercise for you to get into the markets. So in conclusion, you know, it really doesn't come down to current market conditions. We've seen some profound movements in markets, but I come back to this point that an investment is a long-term exercise, that the sooner you start, the more opportunity you're giving yourself to reap the benefits of long-term market growth. And to that extent, as I said before, make a start and get on with it.
Excellent, thank you. I definitely can say I've never been able to time the market correctly, so I think we should definitely follow your advice. So moving back to you, as you know, and Simon just touched base, retail investors, they go through a risk profile assessment before investing their capital. However, over time, you know, the risk profiles can change due to different reasons, or it might be that market movement change the risk profile of the investor's portfolio. How can investors know if their portfolio is still in line with their goals?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. And if we move to the next slide, we've illustrated there. So if the market moves, so will be your portfolio allocation, right? And therefore, it's really important for investors to check in with their financial advisors regularly and see how their portfolio has evolved. We've illustrated that here, for example, a typical 60-40 portfolio, so 60% equities and 40% bonds at the end of 2010, or sorry, at the beginning of 2010, would have resulted into a 75% equity portfolio and 25% bond portfolio at the end of 2019. So it might be that your portfolio allocation is not in line with your strategic asset allocation, which is in line with your goals. So therefore, it's important to regularly check in with your financial advisor and really rebalance your portfolio in order to make sure your portfolio stays in line with your strategic asset allocation. I would say at least once a year. And once you rebalance, I would advise to do it in a staggered way. So not at once, because if you basically rebalance your portfolio at once, you're effectively timing the market again. So do it in a staggered way, I would say at least once a year, in order to make sure your portfolio remains in line with your strategic asset allocation.
Great. I guess another option will be also multi-asset funds will definitely do that rebalance for clients and making sure, you know, they will remain the same risk profile.
Yes, in a multi-asset, it will happen automatically. That's right. Yes.
It's Simon. If I see financial planning as a guide for meeting financial needs and long-term goals, what is financial planning to you, and what are the factors what one needs to consider?
Yeah, Chris, I would say in a nutshell, financial planning is all about having financial good health. You know, we all want physical good health, we all want mental and spiritual well-being. It's increasingly important that we look after our finances in the same way. And why do I say it's increasingly important? Well, you know, we live in an age, for example, where more and more of us are going to live to 100 and maybe beyond. We might be retired for 30 or 40 years and we need financing during all that time. We still need to afford to live and do the things we want to do. That money's got to come from somewhere. And the reality is that governments are not the backstop that they used to be for people's pension requirements. Some people may have corporate pensions that they can call upon, some people don't. It needs to be evaluated if that's enough to cope for people's retirement needs. Another consideration is people have children and they start worrying about university. University is very expensive. I know this. I have 2 boys who are at university and I have planned for this very situation. You know, that's obviously a key area where planning in advance can make such a huge difference. And then another area which I would address is the fact that catastrophe can happen. People die, people get critically ill. These things happen out of the blue and they have a massive ramification on people's financial picture. Financial planning doesn't take away the pain, but it can ease the financial repercussions of those disastrous events. And so essentially what financial planning is assessing and evaluating a person's current financial situation and coming to the consideration as to whether it's sufficient to cope with their current needs, but more importantly, their future needs and their future priorities. And it's all about looking at this as an ongoing exercise. You know, it's just like, for example, we might go for an annual medical checkup, or, you know, we might like to have the car serviced on a regular basis. In some ways, you need to look at your finances in the same way to make sure that everything is still in the right place and still doing what it needs to do for your current needs and your future needs. And there's an additional point here that people's financial planning changes over time because their lives change. You know, you look at a simple analysis, you know, people start working after their education, they get married, they have children, their children grow. And that's even not considering the things that happen out of the blue, which can impact finances. You know, a divorce, for example, has a big impact on finances, or those catastrophic incidences, which I mentioned. the whole point of financial planning is trying to insulate people against those things and keeping people one step ahead of their financial needs. Another consideration that I want to bring out here is that financial planning is holistic. There's quite a temptation to think of financial planning as just looking at how your investment is doing. Obviously, that's important, and that's got huge meat to it. But proper financial planning includes that, but goes far beyond that. So it really covers everything. A holistic picture of even your liquidity, how you're protected in terms of having the right insurance, not just how your investment is performing, but how it's performing relative to your long-term objective. Are you on track for your retirement goal, or is there more that you need to be doing or that you can be doing given the kind of investment or savings firepower that you have? And so from that point of view, financial planning is then a long-term relationship exercise, ideally with a financial advisor who's got the expertise to look at your whole picture, do a step-by-step analysis each time, look at how your money is performing, but also just make sure that everything is set up the way that you want it to be, not just for your current situation, but making sure that you are very much on target to achieve your long-term financial objectives.
Thank you, Simon. Back to you. We touched base on aligning risk profiles with investment goals. What is risk tolerance for you, and how can investors know what the risk tolerance is?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question again, Cris. And if we move to the next slide, well, first of all, like Simon said as well, risk tolerance is a very subjective phenomenon, right? I mean, it's different for all of us. It depends on your psychology, it depends on your time horizon and your goals. It depends on your personal situation and the liquidity in your assets, as Simon mentioned. But so first of all, risk tolerance is a very subjective matter, and it's usually investigated by means of a questionnaire where obviously risk-related questions and your attitude towards risk are being measured, which then usually often results in a certain risk profile, right? From very conservative to very aggressive. But on the other hand, your risk tolerance is often not fully understood until it's actually tested. Like, for example, which was the case in March last year when we had the market volatility. So again, it's very important to check in with your financial advisor after such an event of market volatility, and to discuss with him how comfortable you felt with that market volatility. Because each portfolio allocation, as we've illustrated on this slide, basically has a different return dispersion. For example, here you see a 100% equity portfolio over the last 20 years had a worst year return of -48%, right? And a best 1 year return of 59%. Whereas your typical 60-40 portfolio had a worst 1 year return of -33% and a best 1 year return of roughly 40%. So again, the more conservative asset classes you add to your allocation, the more conservative, obviously, the risk profile. So again, it's very important to check in with your financial advisor after a volatility event like last year and discuss with him how you felt about that market sell-off, and to adjust your forward-looking asset allocation accordingly.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Leo. That question for you, Simon, and I think this is the last question of the webinar before we go into Q&A. So, how do you think young investors should approach financial planning? What will you say to them under these current circumstances?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Cris. I think the immediate thing I would say is that you're never too young to start financial planning. Even if your needs in the early days look quite simple, you've still got long-term objectives. They might seem very far off, for example, retirement planning. They might seem very intangible. But as a general observation, and I'll deal with these points more specifically, but as a general observation, the earlier you start your financial planning, the easier, and just as importantly, the cheaper it will work out for you in the long run. There are 4 areas that I would immediately draw attention to with millennials or young people, whatever you want to call them. The first is let's just make sure your cash position is in the right place. You know, no one wants to stop you being the party animal. No one wants to stop you being a competitive triathlete and taking part in lots of expensive competitions. You should still be able to do all those things. But let's make sure you can afford it, that it fits in to your financial picture, that you've got into the habit of budgeting, and that you can see that everything is sustainable, that, you know, not only you can put food on the table and pay the bills, but you can do these things that you like doing, and also have the cash cushion, which I talked about earlier, in terms of being able to address potential emergencies. So that's really important, and it gets people into very good habits at an early stage in terms of, you know, doing a fairly careful budgeting exercise on a regular basis. The second point that I would like to make is, let's get you insured. You know, when people are in their 20s and 30s, they often feel completely invulnerable, as healthy can be. They're never going to get cancer. They're never going to have a heart attack. They're immune to all of that stuff. Bad news, people, you're not immune to it. And very simply, the earlier you insure yourself, the cheaper it's going to be. And, you know, you can have an insurance policy that covers you for life or covers you for critical illness that can last you for the rest of your working life, and you're paying the same cost for the length of that policy. I mean, for example, I mentioned my boys earlier. My boys are aged 20 and 18. They probably don't fully embrace it or get it, but I've got no hesitation in putting in place long-term insurance policies for them, because it's cheap as chips. And yeah, one day they'll probably appreciate that they've got these very meaningful policies that will protect them for the rest of their working lives. So like I say, the earlier you insure yourself, it's never going to be cheaper. Third point I would make is, if you can start saving, save. Now, I acknowledge that a lot of people who are starting out in their working lives, they don't necessarily have the disposable income. But if you can do something, if you can start saving, the earlier you start, the easier you make it for yourself in the long run in terms of achieving those long-term goals, such as retirement planning. Just pulling a few numbers, you know, if we make an assumption, for example, that you want to retire at 65 and have $1 million sitting in the bank, although let's be honest, we should be thinking more about $2 million to allow for all these years of inflation between now and then. But, you know, for someone who's 30 to achieve that $1 million, you know, conservatively, you're looking at saving about $700 a month. If you start doing this exercise when you're 40, that figure doubles to about $1,400 a month. And if you wait until you're 50, then you're having to save about $3,400 a month in order to achieve that $1 million at the age of 65. So the numbers speak for themselves. The earlier you can start saving, even if it's just little bits and pieces here and there, the better that works out for you in the long run. And then the final point that I would encourage millennials is, start as you mean to go on. Get into financial planning as a proper exercise and discipline that becomes part of your life. So, you know, engage an advisor, do a holistic map of your financial picture, and just get into that habit of looking at your finances. Even if you forget about it, you know, the 11 months of the year or 364 days of the year, at least you have that one moment once a year, or maybe more regularly, where you can just look at your finances and have peace of mind that everything is in the right place. So as I said at the outset, as soon as you're independent, you've got financial planning needs, let's start getting into good habits at the very outset.
Thank you very much, Simon. Just a quick summary before we go into Q&A. So some of the things we discussed about how to deal with market volatility and the importance of long-term investment and diversification. We touched on how to build robust portfolios and with a long-term focus, how to assess investors' risk profiles and tolerance, different tolerance levels, and the importance of financial planning. So I think now we can go into Q&A. We should have around 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Cristina, do you want to read the first question?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is Christina from MetLife. We've got some interesting questions, I must say. So the first question that we received is, how do we correlate investments with our goals? And how often should we actually review our financial plans? So, Chris, that's up to you. Who do you think we should pass this question to?
I'll leave it up to the guests. Leo, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so it all depends on, for example, the timeline of those goals is very important, right? So if you for example, investing in for your pension, obviously, that for young millennials, for example, that is a goal that is far in the future, right? So in that example, obviously, an investor can take on much more risk and, for example, invest in equities. But if your timeline of your goals are much closer in the future, you probably want to have a more conservative allocation. So the time is obviously of those goals is very important. And I think there was a second part of your question, Cris. Can you please repeat that?
Yes, so the second part of the question, just going to quickly go back to it, was, and how often should we actually review our financial plans?
Yes, I think what Simon said. I would say at least check in once a year with your financial advisor to see, like I showed in the presentation, whether your portfolio allocation is still in line with your overall strategic allocation, or whether you need to rebalance, whether your portfolio is still in line with your risk tolerance. So these are all events that you need to discuss with your financial advisor. I would say at least once a year.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I would actually say, if I can just add, I mean, with my clients, I traditionally sit down with them 4 times a year. We make it a quarterly exercise. I mean, we all know markets move a lot in short periods of time. And so, you know, it merits that more regular update just to see that, you know, we're properly positioned. Even if nothing's going to change in terms of our portfolios, let's just keep a spotlight on what's going on, because I think one thing we have to keep in mind is even if people aren't necessarily going to change their strategies, they still like to see what their money is doing. And you know, part of our job is to give people transparency and visibility in terms of how their well-earned money is performing.
That's great advice, Simon and Leo. We also have an interesting question. If I were to start to invest now, what time this year I should actually start? So in your opinion, so maybe Simon, you could take that on. So there is somebody asking, oh, what is the best time to start this year? Should I wait? Should we start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in some respects, it's probably picking up on one of those sayings that you hear in the markets, for example, sell in May and then go away. You know, this view that there are certain types a year that are more favorable than other times a year to invest. I personally would not get into that kind of discussion. If someone is of a view to invest, start, don't wait. I mean, the markets could well move a lot between the time that you make that decision to when you actually wish to pull the trigger. Whether or not they move in the right direction for you is beyond our ken. But you know, if you're investing and you're taking the long-term strategic view of your investments exercise, then there's no reason to delay. Get straight into it.
Okay, that's great. So we have a next question. I think, Leo, you can take this question. Equities across the world continue to have a good run with US and Chinese equities leading the way. How far is this trend going to continue? Are there any red flags that we need to look out for?
Well, there's a saying at the moment. It's called TINA, which that is an abbreviation for there is no alternative for equities at the moment, because obviously, bond yields are at an all-time low and have only a way to go up, specifically in the developed sovereign world, right? So, and with the monetary easing that is still continues at the moment, specifically in the US. I would definitely say that the equity run will last for a while. So that would be my. It's very hard to look into other attractive asset classes at the moment, with bond yields being so low as they are currently.
Simon, just sorry, Leo, just a quick question on that. I'm within equity markets. What will you favor? Because obviously the US had an amazing run. Do you think investors should start looking at potentially taking some money out of the US and put it maybe in Asia or emerging markets, or do you think the US still offers value?
Well, if we, for example, look at the valuations, then obviously they are not even that elevated as, for example, in the what we saw in the during the height of the technology bubble. But again, like I would say, I would diversify obviously over various equity sectors. Clearly, there's an argument to invest in emerging markets. Perhaps in some sustainable investing, clearly have the future. So don't put your money into one bet, but spread it over various equity markets globally.
Thank you.
That was great. Do we have time, Cris, for a couple of more questions?
Yeah, I think so. I think we got time.
Okay, so that's great. So this would be nice for Simon, I was thinking. What part of income should one actually allocate towards financial planning and investments? Right, so is there any thumb rule that we have, or what do you suggest?
Well, there's two distinct things here. You've got investments and you've got savings. These are different ways of addressing surplus wealth that you have. In terms of investing, I mean, I come back to the points I made earlier about making sure that you've got enough cash or access to immediate liquidity. So we could be talking about 3 to 6 months of your monthly spend as money in the bank or easily reachable. Beyond that is when you start investing. So yeah, if you've got a significant amount of money beyond that 3 to 6 months, that's what you start investing, because otherwise that money is just not performing efficiently and anything losing value because of inflation. So that's what you want to invest. If you're looking at a savings exercise where you do something with your surplus disposable income every month, well, this is why it's important to do a budgeting exercise. Go through the list in terms of, you know, your rent, your utilities, your food, your clothes, your social life, your holidays, everything that you can put together in a monthly spend. Net that out against your monthly income, be that salary or rental income or investments income. This will leave you with a net disposable income figure. I would still suggest leave a good healthy proportion of that, you know, around 50% of that as remaining disposable income, because you want still to have some kind of reserve in case of emergency situations or the kind of ad hoc things that come up and suddenly demand your cash. But then if you've allowed yourself 50% of your disposable income, then yeah, you're doing something meaningful with a good amount of money to start saving it and putting it to work.
That's great. That's an interesting question. How do you think the inauguration of the new US president would affect the markets? And Leo, Simon, any of you could do this. We have many presidents basically who have come. What was the trends and what do you feel happened?
Well, perhaps to answer that question, like I said, there is continued monetary stimulus from the Federal Reserve, and given the Biden election, we probably will see more fiscal stimulus as well. So again, I think this will support certain equity markets. So yeah, that would be my view. That next to the unprecedented monetary policy, we'll see more fiscal stimulus as well.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, markets were making their mind up even before the election took place. You know, when the polls were very much calling it for a Biden victory, notwithstanding it became complicated and it ended up being a lot closer than the polls would have suggested. Certainly in advance of the elections, Biden was the heavy favorite, and markets were responding positively to it, also to the monetary and fiscal measures that were taking place. But the fact that Biden was coming in was not seen as destabilizing for markets, and you know, by and large, that rally has continued to essentially this point in time. So I think it's fair to say that there's generally a sort of presidential cycle in the markets. I mean, Leo might correct me on this, but you know, on a 4-year presidential cycle, the incoming president does tend to see a bit of a bounce in the markets. As if markets give the new guy the benefits of the doubt. He's going to be handing out all the sweeties that he promised in the election campaign. It then comes 2 or 3 years into the presidential cycle where you see a little bit more of a negative reaction in markets. So, you know, I certainly stand by the point that Leo made earlier that, you know, we're looking at a constructive year for the markets. The widest viewpoint is that this should be a good year for equity markets.
Great, Christine. I think we can do one more question. We can do the last one if there's any more questions.
Yes, I'm going to give the tough one for the last one by Devraj. Okay, so a major chunk of our customers are averse to financial planning due to being highly leveraged with multiple liabilities. Okay, what advice would you offer to convince these customers to opt for an investment plan or an insurance plan? So, Cris, it's up to you who you want to take this question.
Probably Simon.
Yeah, I mean, debt. Well, first of all, let's not be too pejorative about debt, because there are good forms of debt and bad forms of debt. You know, you could say the good or acceptable forms are, for example, a mortgage or car loan, where, you know, where there's security against that and where interest rates are low anyway. The bad debt that we worry about is credit cards and personal loans. And really, it's all the more reason to be engaging a financial planner to help you out, because that debt management is instantly the most important part of your financial planning. You need to find a solution to how you can get that albatross from around your neck. And this may come down to, first of all, doing a budgeting exercise to see how much liquidity you can really free up on a monthly basis to really hammer that debt as quickly as possible. Because I would say, as much as, you know, we talk about the importance of saving and investing, it's really a significant amount of bad debt. We really need to address that before anything else. You need to be able to save or invest with, you know, a clear conscience, or the ability to sleep well at night and know that you're not going to compromise or hamstring your ability to save because you're also in a whirlpool of expensive credit card debt. So let's get that sorted out and get someone to help you, because there are strategies, even if it looks like a real mountain of debt to climb, and particularly credit card debt can be so punishing and feel like a real black hole. There are ways that you can address it and really have a finely defined strategy in place to get to the top of that mountain. So yeah, all the more reason to have a planner with you who can then get you through that process.
And the second part of the question is, how do we plan for insurance? Do you think that's something that we need to still definitely do?
Yeah, I would still build that in as early as possible. Okay, let's be fair. You know, if there are cost considerations, particularly if you have got expensive debt that you're servicing monthly, well, we may have to compromise the insurance solution a little bit. Still can't get away from the fact, though, that insurance has to be one of the foremost points of financial planning, because, you know, you could have all the wealth, you could have fantastic investments, something bad goes wrong. If you get cancer or someone in your family gets cancer, that's very expensive. Your medical insurance may not cover it. You may need some treatment. You don't want to be tapping into your investments or your wealth in order to address that situation. Insurance is very regularly cost effective, it's cheap, it's easy, and it just provides so much protection. So, you know, depending on someone's financial situation, let's build that into the equation as quickly as possible. And if we need to weigh the practicality of that up against a debt situation, well, once again, all the more reason to sit down with a planner so you can really identify together the most workable solution.
That's great. We still have questions coming in, but I think we are on top of our hour. And I think there's some great questions, and I'm going to pass these questions to you, Simon and Leo. If you feel that you could answer them, we could actually pass it back. I know exactly who are asking these questions. So I think we're going to wrap up right now. Right, Cris? Is that okay? Over to you.
Yeah, I think we're done. So we come to an end of the first webinar of the year, and hope everyone found it useful and can put into practice some of the lessons that we learned today. I'd like to give a special thanks to both of our panelists, Simon, Leo. Thank you very much for your participation, and looking forward to continue working together with you in the future. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.